Now to U.S. President Barack Obama's brief trip to Africa last week. He is now back here in the United States. The president says Africans must take more responsibility for wiping out poverty, war and disease on the continent. He says the West bears some responsibility for Africa's problems, but not all. VOA White House correspondent Paula Wolfson has more.
The first African-American president of the United States received an enthusiastic welcome in the Ghanaian capital, where he was embraced as family. He responded with some tough talk, the kind of talk only a family member can provide. The president, the son of a Kenyan father, spoke of his personal connection to Africa's tragic past, but he said the time has come for Africans to take control of their own destiny.
Yes, a colonial map that made little sense helped to breed conflict. The West has often approached Africa as a patron or a source of resources rather than a partner. But the West is not responsible for the destruction of the Zimbabwean economy over the last decade. Wars in which children are enlisted as combatants.
He called on a new generation of Africans to build democracy, create opportunity, fight corruption, and end the long cycle of strongman rule and conflict on the continent.
It is the death sentence of a society to force children to kill in wars. It is the ultimate mark of criminality and cowardice to condemn women to relentless and systemic rape. We must bear witness to the value of every child in Darfur and the dignity of every woman in the Congo.
The remarks came in a speech at a packed convention center attended by members of the Ghanaian parliament. The president said Ghana has become an example for the rest of the continent, a country where development is spurred by good governance.
That is the ingredient which has been missing in far too many places for far too long. That's the change that can unlock Africa's potential. And that is a responsibility that can only be met by Africans.
President Obama offered encouragement, especially to the young.
You can conquer disease and end conflicts and make change from the bottom up. You can do that. Yes, you can.
Earlier, Mr. Obama met privately with Ghanaian President John Atta Mills. He also visited a hospital, a symbolic stop designed to highlight American support for development efforts in Africa. But the emotional highlight of his visit to Ghana came at the end, a tour of a coastal fortress where for 300 years countless Africans boarded ships bound for death at sea or a life of slavery. His wife and young daughters accompanied him to the site.
I think as Americans and as African Americans, obviously, there's a special sense that on the one hand, this place was a place of profound sadness. On the other hand, it is here where the journey of much of the African American experience began.
First Lady Michelle Obama is the great-great-granddaughter of African slaves. Paula Wolfson, VOA News, Accra.
Well, and also here now in the studio with us is Paula Wolfson, VOA's White House correspondent.
Back from Accra.
Back from Accra just yesterday, and wow, it must have been one great trip.
Fascinating, absolutely fascinating. Action-packed, very busy as you saw, but extraordinarily interesting.
We can't wait to hear more of your insights, especially on his speech. Now, before we start our conversation with Paula, we also want to take you to VOA's Straight Talk Africa host, Chaka Sali, who was also in Accra, and this is how he summed up President Obama's speech.
I think the bottom line, Dimuyaki, is that he has inspired Africans, really, especially when he talked about aid. He said that aid is not an end in itself. Rather, it should really be viewed as a means to an end, because for a lot of people, you know, Africans tend somehow to be dependent on something that they expect to come from somewhere, as if there is some kind of political, economic manna from heaven. The fact that he came here today and challenged the Africans to be the giants on their own continent and do things for themselves. The fact that he also condemned governments, for example, which hold what he characterized as fake elections just for the sake of hanging on to power. The fact that he criticized those leaders who engage in the shifting of constitutional political goalposts, I think that is very important. Not to mention, of course, that he also appealed to civil society. He talked about an independent media. I think it was a remarkable message that will go very well on the continent.
Well, thank you. That, of course, was VOA's Shaka Sali, host of Straight Talk Africa. That was his summation of that speech. What's yours?
He gave the message that only Barack Obama could give. I think that was the most important thing. This was not an outsider speaking to Africans. This was a man, the first African-American president of the United States, went before the Ghanaian parliament and to a broader audience across Africa and said, point blank, I have the blood of Africa in my veins, and I speak to you as a brother and a son. Listen to me, please. And that's a whole different tone and a whole different message that you might have gotten from, let's say, George W. Bush when he went, or Bill Clinton, the two presidents who previously visited Ghana. This was a son of Africa talking directly to Africans and saying, please listen to me as you would a son.
And along those same lines, of course, he restated why he was in Ghana, emphasizing his respect of democracy, good governance. And I think his fuller message to the African continent was, you practice good governance, you have development, and then we will support you. Exactly.
He cited the example of Kenya, because his father, of course, his family is from Kenya on his father's side. He talked about his grandfather, who was a very noble sort of man, with great principles, who was a cook for the British during the colonial period. And yet, with all the greatness in this man, the goodness in this man, he was still called boy and humiliated by the colonial world. He talked about his father, who came to the United States to study at a time when Kenya's gross domestic product, its output of goods and services, was larger than South Korea's. And now we all know that is not the case today. And the president's point was, South Korea invested itself and made a point of good governance, of building the infrastructure and the government institutions necessary to care for its people and to build its economy. Africa has not. And while Africa can blame the West and colonialism for a lot of its problems, and rightly should, we've reached the point where Africans have to use an American baseball term, step up to the plate. And they have to be involved as well. They can't just blame the past. They have to take control of the present and their future.
And it seems also President Obama was using a lot of the campaign strategy he used here, where he reached out to the people, especially the youth, where he said, take charge.
Yeah, and wasn't it interesting that time and time again, during his speech while he was in Ghana, you heard that refrain of his presidential campaign. We can do this, not you can do this, as much as we can do this. Yes, we, not you. Yes, we can.
Now, Paula, it was a very, very tight schedule for President Obama. He not only had breakfast with the former presidents, including the current president of Ghana, but he also went to Cape Coast Castle. What would you say were the highlights of that day?
Oh, there was so much. There was so much. I thought it was interesting that he met not just with the current president of Ghana, but the two past presidents, a way of highlighting the peaceful transfer of power, not just from president to president, but political party to political party in Ghana, something that does not take place very often, as you know, in Africa. There was a visit to a clinic, a maternity clinic, where he could highlight maternal care, where he went with his wife to meet with the pregnant women and to see the babies.
And he pledged $63 billion for health.
There was, of course, the speeches we talked about and the emotional high point, as you saw in the package, Cape Coast Castle. He wanted to take his children. And it was interesting watching him, especially Sasha, who's 8. She was clearly, emotionally, a little shook by the whole thing. We could see him with his hand on her shoulder and holding her hand. She was a little spooked by it.
Okay.
This whole idea of ancestors as slaves and the way they were treated. And he said he was glad he could take his daughters because they could see where they came from and how far they could go and how much they have to give back. And of course, we should note here that while the president himself is first-generation American, basically, on his father's side, his roots are directly to Africa, that First Lady Michelle Obama is the great-great-granddaughter of African slaves. And so on her side of the family especially, and for the girls, there's that extra emotional tug of visiting Cape Coast Castle.
Now, Paula, we've run out of time, but very briefly, I want you to tell me about why he did not give a public address to the citizens of Ghana.
Well, when President Clinton was there during his administration, it was a real mob scene when he went out in the public. And it was virtually a stampede, and people were hurt. And I think President Obama decided to hold back a bit for that very reason, just to keep the crowds in check. He wanted to get a message to Africa, but he didn't want to create a situation where anybody could get hurt.
Paula Wolfson, thank you so much.
Always a pleasure.
Good to see you back here.